I don't think I've had much of a career so far. In fact, I feel like I've been sort of fumbling around to try and start a career for a couple of years now, but here goes nothing. So I started my career, I started my PhD at Strathclyde in 2015 with Elmar Haller and Andrea De Carli. My PhD involved laser pooling and trapping of cesium atoms and tuning their interactions to form a Bose-Einstein condensate of cesium atoms. We built the apparatus from scratch. We had a very tight budget and had to home build a lot of devices, but it worked out in the end. And we were one of 5 groups at the time. I don't know if that's been updated, but we were one of 5 groups in the world to make a cesium BEC. So it all paid off in the end. I don't really know if working on a rare apparatus has benefits for hireability when you go to get a job. Maybe some academics can shed some light on that. In any case, we got some publications from the project while I was around. We managed to perform some atom interferometry on levitated atoms and form some solitons. The publications, especially high impact factor publications, are beneficial when you apply to academic roles, but they're not completely necessary to get a postdoc. It's just sort of a nice to have. And your PIs would be looking out for the high impact publications when you apply. So that takes me on to the choice that you're gonna have to make when you reach the end of your PhD. Industry or academia? So the ideal for me was to perform similar research in maybe in a similar environment to what I did my PhD in, but just with an academic budget. Each role probably has its different pros and cons for each person. If I were to do research with an industrial budget, I would feel a bit less restricted than in my PhD, because you could just buy in objects instead of thinking about how long it would take to build various parts. And I could put my training to good use. So you'll have to make that choice, and there are some points about this dilemma and the general act of job hunting after your PhD. Some of this might seem obvious to you, some of it's advice I wish I was given during my PhD. Don't pigeonhole yourself. If you start academic, you don't need to stay academic. A lot of people think if I do a postdoc, industry is not going to want me. That's not really true. If you spend a long time in academia before companies consider you institutionalized, then maybe you start to struggle, but 1 or 2 postdocs is fine. Likewise, if you take jobs in industry and decide they're not for you, nothing's stopping you from going back to academia. It's quite common for PhD students to not want to continue in academia when they finish their PhDs. It was certainly never my intention to continue down that road. But things like burnout or stress related to thesis writing can be a factor in that. I know a few people who worked in industry and then went back to academia. It's not like anybody's going to tell you it's too late to change your mind. Nothing's set in stone. And the lines between industry and academia are getting a little bit blurrier. So collaboration is being encouraged. You can have researchers working jointly between an institution and a company. So don't feel like you're stuck to go in one route for the rest of your career. Get as much advice as possible as soon as possible. The career service at your institution might have a waiting list. They can provide good advice for looking out for jobs. They can tell you about opportunities or careers events coming up, and they can check your CV. Even if you don't plan on applying for jobs for another year or so, it can be handy to have a decent CV ready to go at the drop of a hat, because it's much harder to do when you're thesis writing, for instance. Talk to your supervisors. They might know about funding coming up, and don't expect them to be offended if you want to get into industry. They'll be just as happy to offer advice, support, or recommendations. Talk to your peers, find out what they plan to do. They might be able to tell you about jobs or companies that suit you if they know you're thinking about the next steps, or they might know about some mailing lists or job websites or companies that you don't know about yet. If you happen to work in a project with industrial partners or other institutions who you might want to work for when you finish your PhD, let them know you're interested. They might approach you when a position opens up. Keep looking out for opportunities even when you're not looking for jobs. If you have the time, checking jobs websites periodically should tell you what sort of roles are common or in high demand and what sort of roles rarely come up. If roles you would like to apply for come up rarely, you might benefit from applying a while before your PhD finishes. Don't be afraid to apply well in advance if you are the right candidate. In many cases, the company or institution to which you're applying might wait for you, especially with your skill set as a PhD. If they can't wait until you're ready to start, you've just gained some valuable application and interview experience, and they'll recognize your name if you apply again. And this last one might be the most important point here. Give yourself a break if you have the time or the resources to do so. The PhD is a stressful time, and thesis writing can be a harsh, intense experience. Take a chance to reflect on the work that you've done, what you've achieved over the last few years, and the progress that you've made. Find your chill, sort your head out, and then reach for the career that you want. That's not what I did. I was thesis writing for a few months unpaid, and then I had a bit of money panic. So after my Viva, my external examiner offered me a postdoc position, and I nearly bit her hand off taking it. So I moved to Nottingham to work in Lucia Hackermiller's group. This was a bit of a trial by fire. The existing postdoc went on paternity leave, and I was working with 8 students at any given time across 3 experiments. It was quite a lot of pressure for a new PhD graduate to learn 3 new experiments at once. This sort of responsibility is hardly ever given to postdocs with no experience, but I was happy to use my previous experience for each one in cold atoms. They all concerned laser cooling and trapping. Experiment 1 involved cooling and trapping of cesium atoms, with which I was well versed. Experiment 2 concerned the cooling of rubidium in a 3D printed chamber. And experiment 3 involved the cooling of fermionic lithium atoms and the tuning of their interactions to form bosonic molecules forming a BEC. The first 2 were unusual experiments, both potentially one of a kind, so they were really interesting to work on. Experiment 1 involved trapping cold atoms in a hole drilled through an optical fiber, interfacing fiber-coupled light with the trapped atoms. There are not many experiments with bare optical fiber passed through a vacuum chamber, and much less a fiber with a hole drilled through it. This setup had applications in quantum memory, for instance, with the storage of light in the atom's mid-fiber to be released later. Here are some images of the fiber hole drilled by one of our industrial partners. A diagram of the vacuum chamber is here also, with a dipole beam used to trap the atoms in the fiber. And here's an absorption image just of some of the atoms trapped through that hole. The thought is that this could also be extended to microresonators to allow the atoms to be coupled to light in a strong coupling regime. We worked with other partners to prototype some chips, sort of along those lines. My point here is that we had some partnerships with other institutions and companies for which I have contacts if I want to work for them or with them in the future. And I know who I would contact if, for instance, I wanted a microresonator with a hole drilled through it. Here was an interesting project, a 3D printed vacuum chamber with optics designed to have low size, weight, power, and cost parameters. This is the chamber itself. It's made from an aluminium alloy commonly used in metallic additive manufacture. This allowed us to get well within the ultra-high vacuum regime, which increases the lifetime of atoms in a trap. The full setup took up about 50 by 50 centimeters on an optics bench, which is extremely small by cold atom standards. We worked with yet another industrial partner, another opportunity to become known to people for your work and the kind of work that you do. The apparatus that we were designing and assembling for spectroscopy and beam power distribution was just made from plastic, but it did the job, and it was tiny by cold atom standards. I contributed heavily to a paper on this setup, which should be on the archive any day now. Another paper that might be of interest if I decided to pursue an academic career. So what did I get from this role? I got to experience what it would be like doing similar work in a similar setting to my PhD, but with a few more responsibilities. Working across 3 experiments accelerated my development as a researcher, and working on unusual apparatus trained me to think outside the box about challenges and their potential solutions. These are all things I could use to my advantage when applying for new jobs. My contract ended a couple of months after lockdown started, unfortunately. Did you know that Shakespeare wrote King Lear while in lockdown for the bubonic plague? That was quite commonly shared on social media as a way to try and motivate people to do things during lockdown. I'm of the opinion that that fact was thrown around far too often. I would guess that very few people managed to be productive during lockdown, and I was included in that. I didn't do anything for the first while, just whatever I could do to get through the lockdown with my sanity. I tried to relax as much as I could under the circumstances, keep in touch with friends and family, play games I hadn't had the chance to play for years, basically taking the post-PhD break I should have taken. There was no point in putting too much pressure on myself. Hiring pretty much just reached a standstill everywhere. There were no jobs going. I changed my status on LinkedIn to looking for jobs. I was browsing jobs.ac.uk daily. Nothing was coming up. I was talking with friends, pretty much making sure everyone knew I was job hunting in case they saw something. As a joke, I posted "someone hire me" as my status on Discord. And to my surprise, I was actually approached by an academic who was going to have postdoc money in a few months. So that just goes to show any sort of vector that you can use to advertise that you're looking for jobs is not a waste. In addition to that, one of my friends directed me to a company that's always hiring freelance paper editors. So I guess this is one of those when life gives you lemons situations. So I ended up editing, well, I applied to edit physics papers. I thought it would be a good way to learn about cutting edge science in my field, to get more experience in the process of publishing papers, and maybe find groups in universities and companies that might eventually want to hire me for the skill set that I had. This didn't go entirely to plan. There were too many physicists editing papers, but I was offered computer science instead, so I took it. It was a fair challenge at first, trying to understand what was going on in these papers. Sometimes it was my lack of understanding in the subject, and sometimes it was a language barrier problem, but I ended up coming in third place in their quarterly awards for positive reviews from clients, so I must have been doing something right. Another friend approached me with news about a company in Glasgow that was looking for a quantum optics engineer. This was a space engineering company called Craft Prospect. And I was definitely interested in applying. The few hundred hours I sunk into playing Kerbal Space Program could have told you that. I was a little concerned that I wasn't going to be using my experience in cold atoms like I wanted, and that I was a bit out of my depth, having never developed anything for space before, but I wasn't going to tell them that. So here comes the next page of pointers. Don't sell yourself short. Don't tell the space company you're applying for that you've never done any engineering for space purposes before. Tell them what you have done that might make you more desirable to them. It's up to them to decide whether or not you fit the bill. So spin your experience. You sort of need to be your own spin doctor here and highlight the things you've done and why they'll be useful to that particular role. I've applied for postdocs and told them about how I'd been in charge of 3 experiments and the challenges we overcame on the experiments and progress that we made and publications we wrote because of the work that I did, really trying to sell myself as a postdoc. But for the space company, I focused instead on the 3D printed apparatus and my efforts to design smaller, lighter laser/optical devices. Design considerations that were made, and I tried to show that I was a jack of all trades, which would be useful for a small company. You need to show the strengths that you have that they're going to want to see for that particular role. While we're at it, be diplomatic. No potential employer wants to hear about your fights you had with your PhD supervisor or your lab partner. Sorry, Andrea. If the interviewer asks about your biggest challenges or failures during your PhD, don't point blame. Try to sound impartial. Prepare slides just in case. Even if you haven't been asked to prepare slides, a visual aid to help explain work you've done before might be beneficial, especially in times like now where interviews are likely to be done into the internet and sharing slides is just really easy. If there are test questions, make an attempt at them. Sometimes the interviewer wants to knock you off balance, take you outside your comfort zone and give you a test. Whether that's asking how you would go about solving a particular problem or determining what a block of code does. They often just want to know what your thought process is and how you perform under pressure. Even if you don't know the answer and don't think you'll work it out, you'll come out ahead if you just give it a bash. Ask questions, talk through the problem, do what you can to try and get closer to the answer, and that might help you. Follow up with the interviewer later. Thank them for their time. Ask questions you've thought of since the interview. This shows that you're still interested and you're still thinking about the job and it wasn't just another interview. And ask for feedback after a rejection. Rejections will happen, and the interviewers know what they were looking for and where you fell short. Turn that negative into a positive. Get feedback that you can use in the future. If you don't ask, you won't get it. Anyway, I got the job at Craft Prospect. It's a space engineering practice. Because it's a small company, each person has to step outside their role a little and perform multiple tasks that weren't necessarily in their job description. So every day is different and I get to step out of my comfort zone on a regular basis. And I'm sort of happy with that. It's a bit like what my PhD was like in that respect. Currently, I'm working on a quantum source for quantum key distribution on CubeSats in low Earth orbit. You can see an early prototype here. This is first going to be used in a Canadian CubeSat and then in a Craft Prospect CubeSat that will launch early next year. We're working to tight deadlines to ensure all the systems are space ready, so my experience in academia still comes in handy. I can contact the additive manufacturer company I was working with in Nottingham, for instance, to have a faster feedback loop with prototypes to make sure that we can still meet those deadlines and test things thoroughly beforehand. It was a bit daunting to change disciplines at first because I wasn't doing exactly what I was trained to do. And I was suddenly rubbing shoulders with people who'd worked in JPL and Hyperloop and at CERN. I suddenly felt out of my depth, starting from square one again. There were a few things that helped me in that. The company takes a very people-first stance. The managing director calls around staff to see how they're coping with working from home, and he often has suggestions for how to handle various challenges. We collaborate with partners at Strathclyde, Bristol, University of Waterloo. They all have experience with optics in space, so I'm not totally lost. We're encouraged to research how to bring new, interesting directions to the company, and there's a bit of freedom with that, so there's a chance that we'll look at cold atoms again someday. We're given regular training in space engineering procedures, so I'm becoming more confident in design considerations for space applications, and we're encouraged to attend workshops and conferences to develop our skills. And then there's the fact that I'm the only person in the company with optics experience. If people have questions about which lasers or optics to use and why, they ask me. My experience fits in well with the team, and that's heartening, while I catch up in the space side of things. Occasionally, I'm asked to give talks on things like how to kill laser diodes, and I get to make dumb videos to take a fairly dry subject and make it entertaining. I don't know if that worked. So these are the lessons that I've sort of learned through my job hunt, my career. Just use all the services available to you. Tell everyone you're looking for a job and post it everywhere. Ask your supervisors for their opinions and advice. Don't pigeonhole yourself into either academia or industry. You can dip your toe in a little bit. Take the time out to relax and reflect. Spin your experience for the role you're applying for. Take everything as a learning opportunity. Be open to opportunities and challenges within your position and find out what's right for you, even if it doesn't match your training, because I think that's what I've done here. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, if anybody wants to contact me, they can contact me at the email address or my Twitter account, and I'll be happy to answer questions online or offline.
Thank you so much, Greg. Great advice. I'm going to stop the recording now for the question session.